other places as well, if you haven't managed to navigate to that yet. Okay. So this session then, what we're going to be talking about, so by we, I mean, hi, I'm Claire. I'm one of the education developers in CIE, and I'm joined by Sam. Sam, give us a wave.
Hello, everyone.
So Sam is also an education developer in CIE, and then we've also got Caroline.
Hi everyone, I'm a lecturer in psychology and I research AI related things amongst others.
Yeah, and I have to say that the brainchild behind this whole study was Caroline. This was her idea of something to do, and she came to us and said, "Can you help me with this?" And we were like, "Absolutely, it sounds great." So what this study was all about was we were obviously getting a lot of requests, sort of, well, from about 2 years ago onwards about redesigning assessments around AI or redesign assessments because of people's worries about generative AI and what students were doing it when it came to their assessments. So the whole concept behind this study was to think about, right, what can we help staff with, or how can we help staff tackle this problem, because it's a really difficult problem and we've known from the outset that it was a difficult problem. So we wanted to try and find ways forward in this space where everyone was struggling and no one had found a clear path yet. So what I'm going to talk to you about in this hour, what we're going to do, I should say, within this hour, is the first half, as I said, will be recorded. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to describe our ThinkAloud study, what we did with staff in terms of looking at their assessments with them and thinking about the impacts of AI on those assessments, and then discuss some of our preliminary findings. So we haven't got around to writing this up properly yet, but we have obviously got the transcripts and we've read them, we've studied them, we've come out with some themes that are coming out of that data. That should take about half an hour. And then in the second half of this afternoon session, and the second half's not going to be recorded, so don't worry about that. What we would like to give you the opportunity to do, if anyone is interested, is run some examples with you. So if anyone out there does have any examples of either an assessment brief or just the idea behind an assessment or a specific question that you'd want to see how AI would perform on, then take the time while I talk through our study to sort of dig out that information or word it in a certain way. And then once you've got your idea and you are interested in volunteering at the end, just pop that in the chat and we can come and pick you out at the end. So the plan for that second half essentially is to split out into 3 breakout groups. The reason we can only do 3 is because there's myself, Sam, and Caroline who are going to act as the facilitators. So there's only 3 of us, so we can only do 3 examples in 3 groups. And that's our sort of a vague plan for the second half. If no one wants to do it, that's absolutely fine. We've just kind of thrown you on the spot here. You've signed up for a session and suddenly we're like, hey, get involved. If you don't want to be involved, that's totally fine. And we have got an example that we're just going to run through just to show you how it all worked in real time and give you a feel of what the entire process looked like. Okay. All right then. So before, you're like, well, Claire, what am I volunteering for? You've told me the very vague briefness of this study, but I don't know the details. So I'm going to talk through that now. So I'm going to talk about what we did in our ThinkAloud study, what the method was, why we chose that method, and then, as I said, look at some of those initial findings. So the ThinkAloud study, the aim of it was to help us design a way forward, a method that we could suggest to staff or work with staff together on, of designing assessments with this generative AI in mind at all times. So we wanted to break down some of the fears that staff had around using generative AI or the impacts generative AI would have on their assessments. So those 2 fears sometimes were sort of mixed together in people's heads, of that they just had a general fear of AI, or sometimes it was, they knew their own limitations and their own lack of skill or experience in using the system, so they wanted to investigate that side. And other times it was, oh, I know my students are using this to do their assessments, or I worry that my students are using this just to do their assessments. So there's two sides of it. Sometimes people have both, sometimes people have one or the other. But through this design, we want to kind of tease out both. And the questions we wanted to answer were, how are academic staff here at Liverpool perceiving generative AI in relation to assessment? You know, are people having different reactions to it? Are people using it in different ways? And then how can this structured reflection that we want to work with them through help move on from that fear and uncertainty into practical solutions? You know, would this actually work as a method to help solve those problems? So what we actually did is we recruited participants from the University of Liverpool. So it was just an internal study. We asked for volunteers. So this was, you know, from all across the institution, just anyone who's interested in looking at one of their assessments in terms of how does ChatGPT, we specifically did use ChatGPT as the one system for everybody. A couple of reasons for that. One, it is the most widely used system. Whenever you survey anybody on, you know, a population of people on what generative AI systems they use, ChatGPT comes out on top every time. And the other reason is in CIE, we have a paid account. So we can be, well, at the time, we could be a bit more controlling over the security and the privacy settings on there. And it meant that we could easily keep track of all of the sort of chats as well. So they were all stored on our CIE account and we could easily have access to those. So that's why we did ChatGPT. We chose academics from Liverpool, obviously because of access and our focus, and as our role in CIE is to support staff within the institution. So those were the most appropriate people. And essentially we just invited people onto a Teams call. And what we did in that Teams call is just ask them to input their assessment brief or assessment question into our ChatGPT account. And then we just talked through what came out of it. So the overall process for that interview sort of thing, we called it an interview because we didn't know where else to call them, but really they were just a Teams call. Either myself, Sam, Caroline, or Rob. I'm sure you all know Rob, also a fellow colleague in CIE. Just sat with them and went through this process with the academic. So the first stage was to input the assignment instructions. And the amount of detail put in at this stage across the number of interviews that we did differ. So some people just copied in an entire assessment brief, they just copied it out of whatever file they had it stored in and shoved that in. Some people wrote quite detailed prompts, knowing obviously you know, having a lot of years experience with ChatGPT, so they knew, for example, to say, oh, you know, provide an answer in the style of a second year undergraduate, and that kind of real specificity to what they wanted the system to do. Other people just sort of wrote in what they imagined the student would do given the assignment brief that they were focusing on. So we had a range of different starting points, but essentially they all start from a point where we've asked ChatGPT to do this assignment for us. That was the first step. Then the second part of it was for the academic to look at the output and essentially talk through that initial reaction to what they were seeing. You know, what did ChatGPT, I can't get the consonants out. What did ChatGPT generate? There we go. You know, how does that compare with what their students would generate? Have they seen anything like it before from their students? Just a general initial reaction to the piece. They then, through that conversation, started to look at it and review it in a bit more detail. So actually, you know, where is this output good? Where is it bad? Where is it missing details? And then through conversations with one of us facilitating, it was like, right, what would a student do next? Or how would you prompt this to make this outcome better or different? Or, you know, if it's missed the point, or if it's gone on off on a tangent, if it's included too much information, if it's included too little, what kind of prompts could we use here to make this output better? Or to make the output, I should say, fit closer to the assessment brief. So that was a review process and a refining process, trying to get ChatGPT to change its output and improve as we went through. through the whole of this process, we're trying to get the academics to verbalize their thoughts and exactly why they're doing certain things. And that's because at the end, what we were studying was actually more the transcripts than the ChatGPT chat. So we wanted to look at those transcripts and say, right, what are academics thinking about each of these things as they go through these stages? What impacts does that have on how they're approaching their assessment design and that kind of thing? So we're really trying to get people to explicitly talk through what they're doing. Hence the ThinkAloud study, even though we accidentally keep calling it a TalkAloud study, but talking always should involve being allowed. So it's a ThinkAloud study. And then finally, that discussion that is then going on really moves into more of a reflective discussion about, right, where is your assignment at in terms of how confident or how comfortable are you with presenting this assignment to students now, knowing that no matter what you say to students in your assessment brief, in your class, that they have access to ChatGPT or one of the other large language models, and they can just do this. The chances are some of them will. Some of them will just see what these systems generate when you ask it to generate your assignment for you. And sometimes that kind of solidified in academics' minds, right, I need to adapt this assignment slightly because from the assessment brief to this output hasn't taken a lot of cognitive thought at all. It's taken very little effort. And if a student submitted this, I can't assess their learning because I don't know what's them and I don't know what's ChatGPT. So I do need to adapt this. Other times, staff were completely happy with their assessment and said, no, having gone through this process, I can actually see that the large language model is not doing what I want students to do. And no matter how we've prompted it, it's still not done the right thing. It doesn't have the right kind of skills, and not that ChatGPT has any skills, but it's not been able to pretend to have the right kind of skills to do this assessment. So I'm quite confident, I'm quite comfortable with continuing with this assignment. And those are both completely, valid outcomes of this exercise. The aim of this exercise wasn't always to get staff to redesign their assessments. It was more a question of, do you need to redesign it? And if you are going to redesign it, which areas do you need to focus on, and that kind of thing. So is there any questions about that process before I carry on? So I'm aware I can't see the chat. So Sam, Caroline, if you could flag anything that comes up.
I can answer a question.
Of course.
Hello, my name is Lawrence from pharmacology. I was just wondering if the idea of the review output verbalized process was to make ChatGPT not to give you the answer that you want, so you can prevent the student from actually getting the right answer. You know what I mean? So rather than make it more straightforward, like describe, or so when you're trying to use more analytical words in order to make it harder for ChatGPT to decipher what you want, or you actually wanted to give you the answer? I don't know how that works.
That's a good question. So in this scenario, what we were really trying to do is get the academic to put themselves in the shoes of the student. So to say, right, pretend to be a student on your course, how would you get this system to do the assignment for you? Or how would you get the system to help you with the assignment? But your question raises a good point of could actually we be using ChatGPT in this instance to help us improve the assignment in the first place? And I think that is a good use case, a good thing to do with it, but it's not something we specifically did in this process. But yeah,
you just wanted to improve the assessment, how the students read the assessment. I mean, the easy to interpret the question that the students were being asked.
So the aim of it, I guess, was to help staff understand if a student tried to use ChatGPT to do the assessment for them, what would the outcome be? What would that end piece of work look like? How far could they get down that process?
Okay.
That was the aim of it, rather than looking at specifically improving the assessment from the go, if that makes sense.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, I got it. Thanks.
No worries. Any other questions about the process and what we actually did? Did I miss anything else, Sam? Did that seem to cover it all?
There is a comment in the chat from Dean. Hello, Dean. The thing I find most difficult is to reflect how to use GenAI in the assessment rather than an all or nothing approach. So either it does it all or absolutely none of the assessment, but where it kind of fits into a wider process. I think that's a really fair point, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about Sam or Caroline, but I found that when we were going through these interviews and this process with staff as well, it was with some individuals, what I found was that the discussion went on as if, and we, the academic came to the conclusion that they didn't actually mind if students were going to use ChatGPT for part of their assignment, whether to get it to write parts or structure parts or things like that, because they weren't going to be assessing that at the end sort of thing. So, for example, I remember one, he said, well, this is going to actually make marking my assignments here easier because previously I've had to mark their, I've had to try and, read their paragraphs that weren't in a good order, that weren't of a good structure. I had to check their spelling and their grammar. Whereas if they're getting ChatGPT to write it for them, I don't need to worry about any of that because that'll all be fine. What I can actually concentrate on is the content. What are they actually writing about, not how they're writing it. And that's where ChatGPT can fall down sometimes. And what he found through going through this process is the content was generally rubbish. It wasn't good content. So although it was written well, the understanding, the depth behind it was not there. So they would have still not got good marks with using ChatGPT or not. It didn't matter. The focus was right. What are you writing about? Where are you getting your information from? And that is one of those areas where you're accepting that students have access to these models. They may or may not use them, but is your assessment at the point where it doesn't actually matter? Because what you're assessing is the underlying learning outcomes that are coming from that course. Okay, nothing else. I'll carry on then to just look at our preliminary findings. So what we found when we were looking at the themes of the interview, so what things kept coming out again and again and again, there was actually 3 stages. All the interviews seem to go through interviewees seem to go through 3 stages of I don't know what to call this, reflection, understanding, I don't know, but just these 3 things happened and always sort of in this order. So there was always an initial reaction that they've typed whatever they're going to type into ChatGPT, and it comes out with the output and starts writing away almost instantaneously. And I think the majority of participants were initially impressed by that. They were like, "Oh wow, okay, that's come up with something really quick, and that makes sense." And oh my gosh. And sometimes that related to sort of their fears about the systems as well, that they're like, oh no, this is doing what I feared it did. It is actually creating work of a good quality, and students are just going to be able to take my brief and copy it in and then get an output and submit it, and I'll have no idea because this looks like student work. It's it's not perfect, but it's still got the elements that I would expect to see in a student work. And then after that initial sort of awe and like, oh my gosh, like impressed by the system, academics then started to read that content. They started to talk through, oh okay, I see that they've structured it well, but actually I'm reading this here and that's not actually related to that subheading, or that would be better placed elsewhere, or those references aren't right. I mean, yeah, we often had the discussion back and forth with the systems of include, scientific references or include relevant references. And it would try and it would make things up and it would maybe suggest references that weren't relevant. And yeah, it's still very bad at that. It makes fewer up these days, but they're still not good references. They're not the best references. So once we'd got past that initial reaction stage, that stage 1, we then moved into that stage 2, which is that critical engagement with it, and that real recognition of the limitations of those outputs. And a comment that came out quite a few times was, oh, this at most could be a solid 2-2. So that recognition that the best output, and this is after a few back and forth prompts trying to improve the system, the best that system could do was slightly below average. These systems were never going to make what staff were considering as, the high distinctions or the first class outputs. They were never getting to that higher level because of the limitations. And staff would then reflect on that and then use that to move on to step 3, which was thinking of the ways forward. So that's where, as I've said earlier, people started to diverge in how they thought and how they were going to approach their redesign. So some staff considered, rather than changing their assessment brief, what they might actually do is change their marking criteria. So whereas previously they, had significant weighting for things like paragraph structure or, spelling, punctuation, grammar, that kind of thing, they were going to put less weight on that now because they know that all these assistive tools are there to help students perfect that with very little effort. So that there's no good putting large weightings on that. Whereas if you put higher weightings on the content and the sources and where they're getting information from, then you can, rather than redesign the assessment, you're just redesigning how you mark it. Other staff, as I said before, that their assessments were now quite vulnerable and they did need to think of how else they could approach this task. And maybe that was for more, like quite simple essay type assignments. Not always, but sometimes it was that kind of assignment. And they thought, right, I need to think about this more. I need to come out of this session and reflect on it even more than we can, deal with in this hour and a half. And as I said, and then there was a third kind who were just like, no, I've no concerns about this at all. I'm going to keep doing this assessment. So one example I remember from one of my interviews, someone was doing an assessment about reflection on practice. So this is a student that's been on placement for a significant period of time and then is writing a reflection about that placement. And they went through the classic 3 stages. The initial reaction was like, oh, wow, that's a really well-structured reflection. It's got all the sections in it that I would expect to see. But then they started to critically engage with the content and went, oh, actually, there are very significant things missing from this that would mean this would actually just fail. And the actual really significant thing was that ChatGPT had written this reflection as if the student would be out there independently working on their own and doing all these things on their own, whereas actually what students do on placement, especially at that stage of their program, was they're very much constantly working with a supervisor, with someone who has complete supervision over every activity they create or every activity that they do. So their reflection is constantly, I worked with my supervisor on, or I worked with my supervisor to do this, or my supervisor showed me to do that. All of that was completely absent from this reflection because, ChatGPT did not understand that was what the placements looked like. Now, whether, more tech-savvy students could eventually get there, but I think something like a placement reflection is so personal and is built on so much experience the student has gone through that by the time the student has had to input all of that experience into the system, they're going to have spent more effort than they would if they'd just written the reflection in the first place. So the thinking way forward from that one was definitely, I don't have concerns about this assessment. I'm going to keep doing it as we've done it, and I think it's still going to be successful. So the thinking ways forward wasn't always a necessity for change, I guess, is what I'm getting out there. So those are the 3 sort of stages that the participants went through. But as well as this finding, we ourselves, so as education developers and Caroline as a researcher on the project, we also reflected on what we were learning from this. And one of the big things that we really learned through this process was this need for generative AI literacy. So really understanding or getting people to understand what generative AI is good at and what it's not good at. So through the interviews that we've done, we noticed a huge difference in staff knowledge and staff skills in using the different generative AI systems. So some people would literally come on to the call and we'd be like, oh, okay, open up ChatGPT. And they were like, how do I do that? I never opened it before. I don't know what I'm doing at all. So we had to start from that point. Whereas other people had, multiple accounts for all the different systems and were used to interacting with all of them. So we've got a huge range there in that level of knowledge and level of skill. So there is a need for training there, especially for people who maybe haven't engaged with the systems at all. And that is something we have tried to incorporate into the university over the last 12 months. Sam and I have run several AI dedicated training workshops over the year, and we continue to do so on a request basis. So if anyone does feel that their department or their school or whoever needs more training on AI, just contact CIE and we'll get that set up for you. But underneath that need for training, what then that also then leads to is this inequitable student experience. So because different staff have different levels of confidence and different levels of understanding in AI, that means students are getting different experiences on their course in terms of how staff are talking about AI, whether they're talking about it at all, how much it is or is not incorporated into their assessment, how much it's been considered in the assessment design. So it's just to help build the equitable student experience, what we need is that training for staff and to help narrow that differing knowledge gap. So that's sort of the end of my talking. Is there any questions about our study before we move on to the second part? Just trying to bring up the chat. I did see it pinging before. So I'm just going through the chat here. Yeah, GenAI reflective statements are junk and disconnected from any credible or meaning experience. That's strong. I like it, but yeah, true. what we've also definitely found. Sam, do you just want to talk through your comment there? It's quite long. That's all.
Sorry, I typed far too quickly. Yeah, I mean, the three-stage model, that's absolutely the unifying experience we had. I think it's worth also pointing out that there was a pre-study stage, I think, that we could also kind of highlight just very quickly, which I've kind of tentatively called the stage 0, which was that kind of preconception about what the generative AI could do to that assessment before they got to us. So part of the value of this study was kind of having a go with the generative AI in a situation or in a context where you can talk with somebody who essentially can help you work through that problem, as opposed to doing it on your own. So the academics either panicked before they kind of got to us and thought, oh my God, ChatGPT is going to be able to do this assessment for me, and I kind of don't want to look at it. And oddly, very few people we spoke to had actually tried before they got to us. There was this kind of innate sense of ChatGPT can do the assessment for me. Have you actually tried to get ChatGPT to do it? No. And I think that might simply because they were panicking about it, or because they hadn't thought to, or because they weren't sure what to ask it, or because they didn't know how to access it. There were at least a couple of participants who just genuinely didn't know how to get into the AI to have a go with it. So the kind of conversation was necessary just simply for that kind of controlled environment, or at least supportive environment, where you've got someone there to sort of help you work through the problem. So there was that side of it, or there was that kind of side of, I'm going to come and see how this operates because I'm quite confident that my assessment is resistant to generative AI, and I just kind of want to test that theory. So there were a few people who came to us and said, oh, my assessment's fine, but because you guys are experts in this, I mean, no one's an expert in it, but that was the perception we gave off for some reason, we think you'll be able to break it in whatever way. So I'm going to come and have a go with this study, and I'm going to do everything I can to get AI to do my assessment for me, but I'm pretty sure that it can't. And oddly, though, both of those kind of sides of the experience crystallize into the 3 stages that we've outlined. So regardless of whether they were confident, regardless of whether they were panicking or concerned, everyone kind of came in and said, oh, that's surprisingly good compared to what I thought it could do. Either I'm panicking now because I was already concerned that I've been proved right, or it's way better than I expected. Therefore, I need to do something about it, which kind of pushed everyone into those 3 stages. So we helped to kind of funnel them, I guess, into a unifying process, which was one of the reasons we thought this was so useful, because everyone's having that kind of distinct and individualized experience of how they're emotionally reacting to generative AI. And that it helps to sort of create a unified process that we can sort of follow regardless of where you are on that spectrum from concern to confidence, I guess.
Yeah, great point. Absolutely. Okay. Any other questions about the study or the findings before we move on to part 2?